Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Today we present our interview series, China and the World. The world is facing a surge in deadly conflicts since World War II. About 2 billion people, a quarter of humanity, live in conflict-torn places. Ukraine, millions of people have become refugees. In Sudan, heavy fighting have led to rising civilian casualties. China has spared no effort in quickly providing humanitarian aid to many countries. In recent years, China has sent help to Afghanistan, earthquake-hit Turkey and Syria, and flood-prone Pakistan. That's on top of donating medical equipment to over 150 countries at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Meanwhile, the country has been sending medical teams to developing countries around the world for decades. China's contribution is widely respected, said Pierre Pachenboom, personal envoy of the International Committee of the Red Cross President for China. ICRC is developing to helping people affected by conflict and armed violence and promoting the laws that protect victims of war. Pierre, welcome to CGTN.
Thank you.
A lot of things going on around the world. The Sudan crisis is one of those. We understand there's a lack of medical supplies and also the number of casualties for civilians have been increasing. Now, what is ICRC estimates and assessment of the situation?
First, it's a dramatic escalation of events, and the first thought that comes to mind is the anxiety, fear, and security risks that the civilian population faces in the capital Khartoum, but also in other cities. And when you think of fighting taking place in such a heavily urbanized environment, it means really very difficult for civilians to be safe. And so the first call is on the parties to exercise restraint. And as you pointed out, the other issue of great concern is the possibility to evacuate civilians who have been injured to hospitals, but also to make sure that these hospitals are supplied. And right now we are getting calls and messages from several hospitals that have their electricity supplies interrupted, their water supplies interrupted, and they're very concerned about the current developments.
What do you see are some of the most crucial points that you, during the negotiations like this, that you would convey to different parties, usually?
So first we would convey the need for restraint and respecting international humanitarian law, which what that means concretely is protect civilians, make sure that civilians and civilian infrastructure are not targeted, and that when there are injured or people are killed, that either the bodies or the injured themselves can be evacuated and treated with respect and dignity. Those would be the fundamentals. But then, of course, there may also be people who are captured or detained, in which case they should be treated humanely. So there are a lot of these types of messages that are currently being communicated by our colleagues.
Now, ICRC has been working with China for more than 7 decades now, if you look at the calendar. It's really very impressive since the founding of the new China, I guess. Yeah, since the founding of new China. So how do you see the evolution of this cooperation? And now looking at the evolving world, how would you upgrade this kind of cooperation?
The ICRC's role is enshrined in what are called the Geneva Conventions. These are treaties that were adopted in August 1949 after World War II to impose new limitations and constraints on the parties that engage in war. And after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the government analyzed the treaty, and it was Premier Zhou Enlai communicated China's decision to recognize the Geneva Conventions, saying, as he did in that statement, that China was doing it because it believed that these treaties were generally conducive to peace among all nations. That's very close to the original quote. And I find that as a milestone in our relationship, something very significant. And based on that, when we opened the delegation here in 2005, we wanted to take that dialogue with China forward on international humanitarian law, on general principles of humanitarian action, and get to know each other better. And I find in this phase now, also because of the polarized international landscape because of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, for example, but also the developments that we had in recent years in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Our communications with China in its ministries, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also other partners here, has certainly intensified and diversified and deepened on many of these aspects, and I found that very positive.
So, about Ukraine, let me ask you specifically, what kind of interactions are you having with the Chinese official side? Meanwhile, how is ICRC working with China in order to contribute to a possible peaceful solution to a conflict?
We have been highlighting our assessments of the humanitarian priorities in Ukraine, describing what we see as being the key points, also emphasizing that the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law should be better respected by all sides in that conflict. And we found that there were good opportunities here to discuss both with ministry officials, but also with think tanks, academic institutions, and to exchange views on this and experiences. And I just want to note in that regard that I found very interesting in the recent statement that was issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the question
in China
of the political settlement of the crisis in Ukraine, that among the 12 points that were listed, and I will not comment on the political dimensions of it, but there are 2 paragraphs that focus specifically on humanitarian questions: protection of civilians, protection of women and children, the need for humanitarian action to be neutral, but also the focus on the respect and respectful treatment of prisoners of war. These were very important messages because they are the key messages contained in the Geneva Conventions, and we find that that's a very important basis for future communications. States are the ones that will deal with the question of conflict resolution. That is not a role of the ICRC. But of course, our work on the ground hopefully also contributes to preserving spaces of humanity that can also in the future be important.
How important it is that the media, for example, and the public advocacy will be able to see some of the points that you just mentioned, because it seems that there's more an issue of whether a willingness to see, a willingness to listen to, vis-a-vis whether these information is available or not.
It's an interesting point. You know, I think armed conflicts are by definition very polarizing events. And my experience, having worked for 30 years now, either in conflicts or in relation to conflicts, is that sadly, when conflicts begin, the message we hear the most frequently is that people no longer want to talk to one another. And then when you have a globally polarized environment around Ukraine, but also more generally among major powers, then the tensions and the polarizations become very difficult to manage for everyone. And my very humble hope is always that, in fact, in times like this, there would be more willingness to communicate, more willingness. Of course there will be disagreements. Of course people will have, countries, individuals will have very different views.
That's why they have got conflict, isn't it?
There is a conflict, and also the countries that are not directly involved in the conflict, they will have their opinions, because states have opinions and they have interests. And our humble message is just that while this conflict goes on in Ukraine, we need to do everything possible to reduce the amount of suffering for civilians, for prisoners of war. And that requires a sense of responsibility in terms of states messaging. What we say is we would like states to make international humanitarian law a political priority. That to make sure that while efforts, long-term efforts to hopefully bring an end to the conflict at one point are underway, that the humanitarian focus and the respect for the international humanitarian law be safeguarded and guaranteed also by the involvement of states in that regard. So we find that is a very important paradigm, and we are keen to continue our communications with all states, but here also in China.
Tell me more exactly what might be some of the most important points that the international community need to know about cooperation between China and ICRC now on the international scene.
Very important, because what we are working towards and have had some initial interesting developments in is to cooperate more closely, for example, with the Red Cross Society of China. And we have received from the Chinese Red Cross support to our operations in Afghanistan, Ukraine, and this year in Syria, which we welcome, and I think it's a sign of what could be further developed.
What kind of support?
So in this particular case, it's financial support to our operations in these countries. Now let me give you a concrete example with Afghanistan. So it's the evolving trend in China of combining the bilateral support with more multilateral engagements with organizations like the ICRC. And what we valued particularly was, in the case of Afghanistan, the request that we had made was for support from China to our activities in the Mirwais Hospital in Kandahar, which was built by China in the 1970s, and that the ICRC has been supporting for many years now. And the Red Cross Society of China provided us specific funding for that activity. So we're very grateful for this, and we see this as a basis for future developments. We're of course also in close dialogue with the China International Development Cooperation Agency, CITCA, to see if we can also there reach agreement on frameworks for funding and other forms of cooperation. That's very important. And these are things that I think we're trying to develop in different parts of the world.
I also understand China has been sending medical teams to developing countries, particularly and the least developed economies over the past decades. I understand that in many cases have been in cooperation in one way or another with ICRC as well. How is ICRC going to work with China on some of these future possibilities?
It's an interesting point. First of all, yes, China, I think, is recognized for these decades-long engagement of the China medical teams deployed to many parts of the world. And our teams have been in contact with some of the China medical teams, for example, in South Sudan or in Burkina Faso and other places, in particular on the African continent. And what we have suggested, and we have been in dialogue also with the National Health Commission
in China,
to be able to have pre-deployment dialogue with these teams. So when they are being set up, and before they actually go on their assignments, that we have an opportunity to brief about ICRC's activities in general, but also in those countries that they will be arriving in. That, I think, creates a basis for even better understanding on both sides of what the activities are, and
trust.
Exactly, trust, which can also ultimately lead in some areas maybe to forms of cooperation or at least of communications on the ground that have been then improved through the trust building. And I think that's an important objective. You know, we are trying similar pre-deployment discussions on, for example, Chinese peacekeeping units that are deployed to certain contexts. And these are all things that we're pursuing here, and I'm very confident that we will have some interesting developments.
Trust is so important. It is so hard to come by. In a conflict situation, it is even more difficult. However, even during the peaceful days, how to maintain a sustainable operation and sustainable trust, that I know is the core of your work. Pierre, tell me more about how you have been trying to do this work.
In the conflict environment, you know, parties that are fighting each other, they don't want to have external actors come into the mix.
No.
They don't welcome you spontaneously. But it is, you know, through what you say about yourself and then how you prove it through your action that trust is built. So you can say that you're a neutral organization and people will hear it, but they will only believe it if they see over time that that is also the way that you behave. And that requires a very strict, you know, implementation by all of our teams and staff. Because it's very easy, especially when you're faced with the emotions of a conflict. You imagine you arrive in a village and you see that there are injured civilians or dead bodies inside. Your first human instinct is to denounce, is to say something about it. I think that's a natural human reflex. But our neutrality means that we first of all want to help people. And in order to be able to help, it's not just to help on the Monday, but you want to come back on the Tuesday, the Wednesday, the Thursday, the Friday. So in order to do that, you need to have this trust, and that's the point that is. And people will always measure the gap that exists between what you say and what you do, and that's how they will develop the trust or not. Here, you know, I think in the case of my work in China, we have accepted something that is very important and learned a lot about taking a long-term view of this relationship. it's very important that one is, because humanitarian organizations tend to be very much in the emergency thinking. You know, something has to, you have an idea now, you want to resolve it tomorrow. Here, of course, we have taken the long haul, and for good reason. First of all, China is a very big country with multiple priorities, multiple issues to deal with, today in an increasingly polarized environment. So we want to be a regular and predictable and respectful communicator of humanitarian priorities globally, and to address and to be understood as well as we can. And that requires patient networking, that requires creating an environment in which our messages are well received. And that does, you know, it's not a science, it's a bit of an art, and how do you create it. And I'm very proud of the team that we have here in Beijing, because several of our colleagues, in particular also Chinese colleagues, have been in this delegation since the very opening of it in 2005, so they have the memory of that whole period. I was privileged in the past to visit here occasionally in my previous functions in the headquarters, and when the opportunity came to actually be posted here, I would never have resisted the temptation. It was so interesting to be here, and the only regret at this point is that it will be shorter than I had anticipated.
But we are so glad that you have acquired a very resourceful experience of China, and also been working with some of the key players in China and beyond. So I'm sure it's going to be great resource for the organization for the long haul to come.
I think, you know, and for ICRC, the relation to states is a very important one because of what I mentioned earlier, which is that we receive the mandate from states. So it is also natural for us to go back to states, develop, deepen relations, and realize, of course, you know, we are also with our eyes set on future risks. So today we respond in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Colombia, in Somalia, and elsewhere. But of course, the ICRC also always has to track and monitor what other risks exist for the future. And this requires, again, that you start early with building trust, with being known. Because when the crisis happens, it's also very challenging to develop relations, because people are very, so if you're known in advance, if people are familiar with who you are and how you operate, that is a great advantage in general. And that investment here in China is also very important for us.
Absolutely, lay the groundwork, as they say.
That's very important.
The other thing about peace, it sounds like a beautiful word. Everybody suggests that it is so important. However, when real issues come, sometimes peace will be compromised. Now, for an organization whose goal is to maintain peace and to help those, to bring those to peace, in crisis to peace, tell me more about your thoughts, your understanding about peace.
It's very important, and it's the ICRC's relation to it is a somewhat unusual one, because in a way our work exists because we somehow, even though reluctantly, but we accept that wars have been, and armed conflicts have been a reality in human existence and human experience. But although that is true, and if we open any of our history books, certainly in my country, in Switzerland, I'm sure that the Chinese history books might have also chapters where armed conflicts are analyzed. It's true, one can be forgiven for gaining the impression that somehow wars are inevitable. But I actually refuse that idea. Because I think when we say that, and if that is our attitude towards conflicts, then it means we're not working hard enough to prevent them. And the reason why the ICRC speaks about this is not because we have political opinions about the conflicts. That's not our role. But it's because we know the cost and the price of war. And so when we speak, you know, from the experiences of Afghanistan, of Yemen, of the conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians, it's not an abstraction for us. We know what wars mean and what armed conflicts do to families who suddenly are separated from a relative, and they might not see this person for years because either the person is in a prison somewhere or the front line has divided the families. The destruction, the fear that wars create, all of this is very intimately known by the ICRC. And so while our role is to focus on reducing the suffering during times of war, and we will continue to focus on that very strongly, we call for more attention, new ideas in conflict prevention, and in conflict resolution. Because as you said, you know, peace might be an easy word to refer to. I mean, we can all be in favor or declare ourselves in favor of world peace, but it means nothing if we don't do something about it.
Thank you so much, Pierre.
Thank you so much, really. I appreciate it. Tian Wei.